Right.
Okay, welcome everybody to the December 2024 meeting of the working group on resource coordination to support victims of sexual exploitation, violence, and domestic abuse. My name is Henry Caligari. And before we get started, we'll go around the room and have folks introduce themselves, which is good for as a reminder, but also for the purpose of taking notes. So I'll start to my left, Senator Hellman.
Shelley Hedelman, Senator from District 11.
Danny Ambergoglio, I'm the advocacy coordinator at GBMC. I'm sitting in for Laura Clary today.
Amanda Rodriguez, CEO of Turnaround.
Rebecca Allen, Governor's Office of Crime Prevention and Policy on behalf of Dorothy Lenegar, Director.
Go to that back right here.
And Edwards Captain with Baltimore County Police, on behalf of Chief McDonald.
Morning, everyone. Amy Volunteer Smith. I'm with Baltimore County Department of Social Services, and I'm sitting in for Marks.
Alicia Bidcock, Deputy Director.
And then Kelly.
Kelly Valley Police Accountability Secretary, Board Secretary.
Amy Blank, Baltimore County Commission for Women.
Scott Schellenberger, State Attorney.
And Ross Berkowitz, Baltimore County Commission for Women.
And online, I see we have Councilman Young. And then if we can think, we might look at the participant list and just go down that way and start with Councilman Young and then go through and I'll call out the names and if folks want to introduce their organization they're with today.
Thanks, Henry. Councilman Young, District 1, Baltimore County Council.
Great. And then we have Ms. Calla.
Hi, Dana Kella, Supervisor of Victim Advocacy Services at the Baltimore County Child Advocacy Center.
And Delegate White Holland.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Delegate Jennifer White Holland, representing the 10th Legislative District.
We have Mandy Remmel as well here.
Good morning, everyone. Mandy Remmel, Director of the County Executive's Office of Community Engagement.
Michelle Bernstein.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Bernstein, Grants Assistant with Baltimore County.
Ricky Amador.
Good morning, everyone. Rick Amador, Immigrant Affairs Outreach Coordinator, stepping in for Chief of Immigrant Affairs, Juliana Valencia Banks.
And last but not least, Shelby Frank.
Hi, Shelby Frank, Executive Director, Family Crisis Center, Baltimore County.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining today. So we've been meeting, this working group's been meeting for now a little over a year, approximately once every 2 months. And I first want to thank everyone for participating in this group in its first full year of discussion and meetings. And personally, I found it to be a very eye-opening and B, beneficial experience in and of itself, just the meetings alone, to get this dialogue going and to coordinate between the different stakeholders who are involved in this extremely important work. The hope is to continue this working group into the future. Obviously, there will be a new interim county executive starting in January, but the hope is whomever that person is to continue this work going forward and into the future beyond 2025 and to continue to have these discussions, because obviously this is an issue that is not a temporary one. It's a permanent challenge, and it's one that our hope is that whoever the county executive is will continue to prioritize and to make it a chief goal to reduce the instances of sexual exploitation, violence, and domestic abuse in the first place, and then to make sure that the resources and the efforts are going to the right places from the county level, coordinating with our partners at the state and federal level as well. And again, with the county executive going to the federal level, it's never a bad thing to have that, have the ability to reach out and contact a congressman or person who initiated this working group. The primary focus of today's meeting will be to go over the report and recommendations that was circulated, drafted based off of some of the input from members of this working group, but also from observations and discussions in prior meetings, and also to discuss some of the priorities for next year that may go beyond the policy side, but looking at what topics this group wants to dive into and revisit from 2024. Personally, I would love to see essentially recurring meetings like we did last year or this year on data from the Baltimore County Police Department, State's Attorney's Office, data from providers to essentially see where the trends are. Because based on the data that we reviewed earlier this year, there certainly were trends we could draw from 2021 through now. But as we continue to get further and further away from the COVID-19 pandemic and its after effects, it'll be interesting to see how the numbers and figures change, both from the law enforcement perspective, but also from the provider perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now to pull up the draft of the report, which was circulated. And again, happy to make any edits to this. In terms of the if I have anyone's title that's changed or organizational name that has changed, I'm happy to make those edits. And that's just the first few pages. I've also obviously included, and this will be available online as well, so that the meeting agendas, notes, and recordings are accessible, as well as a link to the website, which provides the presentations. Not every meeting had a presentation, but that way the information from the department and the providers and the presentation on the corrective order process, those are all available online, which actually segues nicely into some of the recommendations. And I'll briefly go over these and then happy to turn it over to the group to discuss whether there's any additional ones. Because this, I'll note, because this working group, unlike some other boards and commissions in the county, doesn't have a statutory mandate, there's not a requirement that each December is the only time that recommendations can be made. It's fluid and it can happen throughout the year. And there's no requirement that this report be completed today. If there are things that people want to add, those can be added or just simply discussed at future meetings. I know there are several boards and commissions I work with where there's a drop dead, there must be a report sent out to certain stakeholders by certain dates. That's not the case here. So, and that's one of the benefits of this group, is there's not a limited or narrow requirement.
So,
The first recommendation, oh, yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Councilman Young, just wanted to, so this is, for all intents and purposes, your first draft that hasn't been publicized yet that you're presenting to us for us to review and also make additions to.
That's correct, Councilman. And the hope would be to post the draft at least after this meeting again. But there can be additions or changes to it made subsequently. There's not a requirement that, again, if there is a significant change that a member wants, we can make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the first recommendation that is included is based off of one of our earliest meetings and one of the most consistent challenges that the providers in this working group flag, which is the lack of short-term shelter and long-term housing for survivors. We, in February, brought in Director Hickey from the Department of Housing and Community Development, who spoke in more depth on this issue, but broadly speaking, there's a need for additional housing services for survivors, and that the lack of housing creates the potential for survivors feeling the pressure to return to the abuser in order to have some place to live. So this is a very general suggestion, or recommendation, but I think it's important that this perspective be brought into the housing conversation in Baltimore County, which is obviously one that continues to be a high profile point of debate, discussion in the county council, that there's a need and a demand for housing, not just generally speaking, but specifically to this issue as well. I see Delegate White Holland has her hand up if you want to unmute.
Yes, and I appreciate and I apologize if we want to go through everything first and then provide comment. But since I have the floor, I guess I'll chime in. I appreciate the acknowledgement of housing. I see it, of course, as a social determinant, but I would also hope that in this document somewhere that we can also acknowledge, root causes. I think poverty was one of the other driving forces behind what we are seeing and how it exacerbates, intimate partner violence. And so I think that even beyond housing, I think it's about having housing that is connected. What are the other resources and supports that survivors and their families may need to ensure that they, have financial independence as well. So whether it's job training, security, food, other sorts of needs and supports. And so I think it's not only just collaboration with providers, but what are some of the other policy opportunities? I know that I know that the governor is focused a lot on the Enough Act, and I'm not sure where those investments will be targeted across the catchment areas that we've looked at. But that might also be another opportunity for collaboration and ways to help drive not only policy, but looking at other solutions and seeing the interconnectedness between all of these different things that are happening. So I just wanted to see if there's a way for us to weave in and kind of marry some of these things that are happening statewide, but we can also expect to see these things happening even across Baltimore County and other localities. So just wanted to elevate that and make sure that we are flagging beyond housing some of the other social determinants and addressing the root causes that we've discussed about during our time together as well.
Sure, and I thank you, Delegate. And I think that may also intersect with an area of focus for this coming year's meeting, so we can dive more into the details there. But absolutely can be incorporated into this recommendation. But I also want to keep in mind the wanting to make that its own conversation topic and not just include it and then move on. But I think that's absolutely something that probably warrants, and I can reach out, Delegate, we can find time to discuss the best way and the best, maybe some outside speakers as well to come in to discuss how that issue can be addressed and given its own meeting and its own space to have really a full-fledged discussion on it.
Fair enough. No problem. Thank you.
I'm just going to add to what the delegate said. I think there are things that are unique to domestic violence survivors and intimate partner survivors that need to be taken and noted here. Everyone, we all know that there's a housing crisis in the country, in Maryland, in the Baltimore area. And so what is it about this community, this population that is unique, and how are the housing issues that they struggle with different from the community at large that we can articulate here to let the council know that, maybe somebody with a protection order needs to get a preference someplace. I mean, maybe we need to have more shelter spaces. Maybe we need to put more investments in hotel rooms so that there's temporary shelter for somebody who's in the, fleeing immediately for 10 days. Those are just 3 things I'm coming up with off the top of my head and I'm sure we could come up with 50 more here that are very specific to this community that I think this group specializes in and has a lot of experience and know-how on that should be incorporated here.
Sure, and that's exactly what I'm happy to add that language in there, because I think, Senator, you're entirely correct, and that's part of the hope of this conversation today, right? Is to take kind of these general, here are some of the things we discussed, and the best way to zero in on them and ensure the language is specific enough so that it's actionable. The second topic or recommendation that came up and that Ms. Valencia Banks, as the Immigrant Affairs Officer, highlighted throughout the meetings is that Baltimore County is A, increasingly diverse, and B, it has within its diversity, there's diversity within diversity. So there's a large number of about 12 or over 12% now of the county's population are immigrants, and within that group, there's a tremendous amount of diversity within that group. There's not one particular nation of origin or region of origin that predominates. So the need to, and in talking to Juliana one-on-one as well, there is a continuous need for county services and for providers to, again, invest in and make sure there's adequate support for people from different communities and that there's outreach to those communities, because even something as the definition of what constitutes domestic violence differs in different communities, and how to best reach those individuals, those survivors who are in need of services is an important issue too. So that's, again, a somewhat general recommendation, but I think it's about following up that conversation. On that note, a topic that I would like to devote at least one meeting to in 2025 would be to highlight that as its own meeting topic, because I do think that there are a number of essentially follow-ups that can be made on that in terms of, okay, what are the challenges in different parts of the county specifically, and where are there holes that are not being patched? So just again, speaking on an issue that Juliana and I discussed, is that for instance, in northeastern Baltimore County in the Perry Hall area, you have a large number of people from India and Southwest Asia, which is obviously going to require different outreach than in a part of the county that has a large community of immigrants from Latin America, Mexico, Central America, those communities, because there's just different language, different culture, different religious beliefs. All of those things require their own unique outreach. And while this recommendation, again, is somewhat general, I think the hope is in 2025 to dive into that in more detail and to really flesh out what specific communities are, where there's a need, and what that solution to that need looks like. But this is more flagging it because, again, I think very often there is insufficient discussion or focus, not necessarily in this working group, but more broadly speaking, on the different needs of different communities in Baltimore County. And the third recommendation, which is a more, I would say, more definite one, and one that can be done hopefully very quickly and very straightforwardly, is to create essentially a one-stop digital shop that provides a web page on the county website that would essentially break down a list of all the providers, their addresses, and the services they provide, as well as a description and links to information on the legal process and the protective order / peace order process. Because I can tell you, I have a background prior to coming to the county in family law, so I was familiar with the peace order and protective order process, but it's not one that a layman necessarily is going to have a familiarity with. And I think the presentation that the department provided on that was incredibly useful and instructive, and is one that can be made more broadly available to members of the public. I also think that providing a breakdown of what it looks like if a survivor is to go directly to the Baltimore County Police Department is useful, because there is, when one of the first things I did when I was put in this position was to essentially go online, Google, what's the process? Because I wanted to put myself as much as possible in the shoes of somebody who was coming at it without any sort of institutional information and knowledge. And there's a lot out there, but there's not one site that sort of says, here's what the process looks like, here's what services are available, here's where they're located, here's the difference between the different providers, because providers fill different parts of the process. So I think having that one-stop shop helps to simplify it for someone who is in a very difficult situation and is in need of that information kind of on one site. Okay, where do I go for this? If I'm considering a protective order, how do I go about it? Where's the nearest district court to me? All that information I think should be made available, and other jurisdictions do that. So most jurisdictions have that web page where you can just go to it. Anne Arundel County has it, for instance, and again, links to the providers, links to the addresses and the court processes. So that's something that can be done, I think, relatively quickly and easily. And I think this working group, the meetings we've had, highlights the need for providing that information in a straightforward way to survivors.
So, I mean, like Amanda, your website turnaround is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
Um,
And MCAS and MNADB do that. So I don't want to cut you off.
no, and
Yeah.
so that was my point is, I understand how you want everything in one place, but it seems to me that we can launch the county website and make reference to yours and MCAS's and the other ones, so that people can kind of click on everything to go through that instead of reinventing the wheel because it's kind of already there.
And that's part of the goal
Okay.
is to point people in those directions. Because if you're someone who has no background in this and doesn't know what turnaround is, they may not look to the website. But pointing them and saying, hey, here is the link to turnaround or HANA or any of the other websites in the county or providers in the county, I think is part of the goal of that. Because if you're someone who doesn't have that background knowledge, I think pointing them in that direction is useful.
I mean, I suspect if you Googled right now and said, I'm a domestic violence victim, I need help, I would think your website and
Sure.
and CASA's would pop up pretty close to the top.
We're second.
Second?
When the police department launched a site specific to sexual assault, that's in essence what we did. We pointed to some of the locals. A couple key points there is some of the features, and I think you could probably put together a small working group out of this group to work on it. It's not as simple as a straightforward web design. Right. There needs to be like easy exit, quick exit feature. I've seen some others that are professionally designed and it's really softened, so it's gender neutral, race neutral, ethnicity neutral. But I do think pointing to that, another key part for us as the police department was we knew that these organizations are going to be much more apt to keep it updated with current contact points and current methods than governmental. By the time it filtered to us, it's late. So my suggestion would be pull together some of the key stakeholders that have the website, accentuate everything that they have, and then.
Yep, that's part of the goal, I think, too, is to not reinvent the wheel, but rather just create another resource to point people in that direction.
So the Family Violence Unit actually came up with a resource card that listed all of the resources and what they do. So we give them out frequently.
Yep.
And I asked that be put on the Commission for Women's website last year. So, I mean, that could be a good start for you.
Yes.
Just to verify everything and use that.
And they do a really good job of updating it.
I just want to add to, I work with the State Board of Victim Services, and on a statewide level, we're looking at creating a statewide victim service directory. So right now it has almost 60 pages, I think, worth. So it's organized by county. So when that's complete, you guys can use that on your website too. We're also looking at creating a victim's guide. So that would walk someone through the criminal justice process, peace and protective orders, victims' rights, things like that. So we're hoping to have that done like spring.
Right. Yeah, that sounds nice.
Yeah.
And it's really, again, I mean, this is exactly what I think the hope would be, to have a website which provides easy access for someone. And again, particularly with that that one of the features I think all the provider websites have, and several but not all county websites, is that quick exit feature. But again, similarly to quick exit feature, having a quick link ability where you can go on it and with limited time and limited background on this issue, be able to easily find some notion of, okay, where do I go from here? But man, I know you were.
Yeah, no, I think that all of the statements have been essentially what I was going to say. I think that a lot of it exists already on different websites. My immediate thought was, does it need to exist on the county site, or is there some other better place to have it? Like, how many people are coming to the county site looking for this information? But if other counties have something similar, having links to us is something that can happen. And I think you also brought up something, Henry, in kind of in your statement. I think that as part of this, it would make sense to me that we are also figuring out a way to market the services for the providers that are in the county. Because there are too many people that don't know that turnaround is the place to call, or family crisis is the place to call, or GBMC is the hospital for your rape exam. And like that causes a lot of issues. I cannot tell you how many survivors have come to me and said, if only I got to you sooner. I wish I could have gotten to you sooner. I didn't know this even existed, and that's a problem. And it seems to be a somewhat unique problem in Baltimore County. I don't see it as much in the other counties where the same, organizations exist.
Right. And I think that's part of it's come up in every conversation. Just piggybacking off of that is how, because of our geography, in a lot of respects, we do have a unique element to the county where if you are in southwestern Baltimore County, you may be not even thinking about Towson necessarily, but there may be, GDMC is got to make the trek there, for instance. And I think that's a really good point Amanda's pushing
Bobby
out this
passed
way.
a bill on telehealth. And
Not there yet.
I know, we're working on it. We're getting there.
And I think the website can be part of that pushing out process where it can provide, again, not only links, but a brief idea of, okay, here's what this provider can provide, here's what this provider can provide. So there is to try to cut through some of the, I don't want to say confusion necessarily, but lack of knowledge that a person may have coming into the process. But my thought is that's something which, again, can be, again, with collaboration with members of this working group, can be done fairly quickly compared to some of the more big picture and long-term recommendations. I mean, for instance, the housing issue is not going to be fixed in one fell swoop, but the issues surrounding, again, providing access and information to what's already out there can be done pretty smoothly.
So that sort of goes to actionable items here. And so do you feel like tomorrow somebody can green light this?
I can get the ball rolling on that process. That would be my hope, is to basically say this has been endorsed by the working group as a solution, as a recommendation, and begin to work on the process for getting it online.
I have a question. So is there any way that if a victim goes to the computer and says, where do I go if I've been abused by my partner, or where do I go if I've been raped, and have that resource pop up?
Mm-hmm. So there are, if you Google that right now,
Okay.
it does provide, the first website is the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and then the next one's Family and Domestic Violence Support in Maryland. And then GBMC's highly up there, Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. And then there is also sort of a list of locations, but it's, again, there's ways to do search engine optimization too. And that's part of the benefit of having it on the website, is if you put in Baltimore County domestic violence resources, the fact that it's on the Baltimore County website, the way that SEO works is it's more likely to pop up towards the top. So that can help, again, someone who doesn't have necessarily background in this. They may not know the difference between, okay, what's the SAFE program? And then the DC Police Department comes up very high on this list of responses, which is not relevant if you're not in Washington, DC. So again, I think that was one of my first thoughts with this working group, is the need to provide an easier online access, because that's how a lot of people are going to go about it. They're not going to necessarily pick up the phone and they just go online and say, okay, how do I quickly find out where I can go from your phone using the internet or from your computer. But at this point, I'm happy also to discuss any other recommendations based on what we've done this year, and also to look at, again, areas of focus for 2025, knowing that, again, this is going to be an ongoing process, and not looking at it as trying to get every solution on the table right now necessarily, but also what we can have specific meetings about and areas of focus on as we go into the next year. This year, I feel like a big area has just simply been identifying the challenges, kind of looking at some of the bigger picture issues, again, like protective order process. That's a big picture process. And then the hope being we can dive into more details and get into some of the specifics. Here are the challenges we talked about in 2024. Let's zero in on those in 2025. But I also want to make sure this working group is reflective, or the meetings are reflective of what the working group wants to be discussing.
The two recommendations 1 and 2, do you want us to send language just directly to you?
Sure.
Okay. And I'll say it to the group since I'm sitting here. I think that for the first one, I completely agree with the delegate. There needs to be somewhat of an expansion into that supportive housing model, where you're actually where services are carved out. I can tell you as a provider that the largest issue is going to be funding. Mm-hmm. And so including something like capital investment in this type of expansion to access, I think is necessary to include, because otherwise we're going to put people into neighborhoods that are not safe, which is really what's available now. I think for the other, for the one regarding culturally competent either organizations or services, I think it's absolutely true. I would request that we also include in the bottom paragraph that it's also building capacity within existing providers, because I don't want someone, because they are from another culture, they speak a different language, that they don't have access to the full breadth of services from a comprehensive domestic violence provider or the designated rape crisis center. And I think that that's what we're seeing with smaller organizations as they pop up, is they can serve a specific niche population, but they can't provide that comprehensive service. And so I think we are more than willing to step into those spaces. We would just need funding and capacity to be able to do that.
Sure. I see Ricky has her hand up, so unmute since this is.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that too. Something that you probably already spoke with Juliana about, but understanding that language access services should go beyond basic translations, to ensure that they are culturally sensitive to each culture and aligned with the unique needs of immigrant survivors. So this means immigrant survivors may experience cultural barriers that impact their willingness to seek help, including fears of stigma, mistrust of authorities, depending on immigration status. Many might fear law enforcement or different cultural understandings of abuse. Therefore, service providers should ensure that language assistance is not only accurate, but also attuned to these cultural nuances. This means offering confidential and private communication channels such as secure hotlines or online resources where survivors can seek help in their preferred language without fear of exposure.
Great. I think that's definitely a big part of this too, is not just the language, but also the cultural differences as well.
I would just add to that, the cultural specificity, language is a huge aspect of that. I think the language we're also need to include the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Sure.
And the sets of language and culture into itself as well as just the cultural underpinnings of culturally specific services. When language is a factor and when language is not. When we're talking about the different experiences of religious communities or people of color as well, I think it's a lot of times I think people think culturally specific, they think language, they think they're good, and it's much more multifaceted. Also with respect to the recommendation number 1, I'm not gonna say a problem, I don't know what the fix is, and I recognize that. But I think that the issue is not only accessibility to affordable housing, but it's also the cost of getting into that housing. Like security deposits have doubled and have tripled. So application fees have increased significantly. So even if somebody has had the ability to safely save some money, which is an accomplishment and a feat unto itself, that small nest egg can just absolutely dissipate when they thought that their security deposit was going to be like 1 month's rent, and now it's 2 or 3 months rent. So now they're scrambling to pay their first month's rent or their second month's rent that they thought that they had saved.
I think we actually changed some of that.
Okay.
Yeah, so that should hopefully not,
Legislatively.
yeah, on a bill that passed this past year. I'm just going to look it up.
Okay.
That hopefully will get better.
Thank you. I would love to see that. And with that, just like, and also just, recognizing that everything's more expensive these days, like moving expenses and people also like that mistake can also disappear if their prior home that they have had arrearages of like BG&E and things like that, they have to pay that off before they can set up new electricity. So I'm not sure if that's something that can necessarily be legislated around or be included in the recommendations. Like I said, I think I'm saying a problem that knowing what the fix is, but I think that is part of the larger housing picture that we're talking about.
No, I think that's actually really beneficial to flag, because I think there's, on one hand, we obviously want specific proposals, but on the other hand, it's also good to say, on top of things that can be dealt with, maybe easily or with a bill, to acknowledge there are these broader issues also still going on, and kind of put them on the table, because if nothing else, it's putting it into the record, so to speak, of, hey, in 2024, the working group identified this as a big issue. If legislation, not necessarily just on this issue, but on any other issue that's flagged, pops up down the road, it grants more of a, hey, this is an area that we can speak to, or legislation that the working group can be tracking.
Also, if anyone didn't know, College Hunks has a domestic violence moving program for survivors that will offer free or discounted moving expenses. It is, I think, on their website, and you have to talk to each individual like location, but
I'm sorry, who does?
College Hunks, it's a moving company. Sorry, it's a really strange name.
College hunks.
Hunks,
Yeah.
yes.
How to work for them.
Oh, what time of year? Yeah.
For a time.
During.
October. It's definitely during October, but I think it's on a case by case basis, like if they have the availability to do it or things like that. But I've definitely helped someone connect to them.
Yeah, because we've had clients who have taken advantage of that
Yeah.
in October.
Yeah,
But I wasn't sure if it was.
yeah.
That's great.
It's definitely October. I think it depends on the location.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you spell?
College.
That's like it's a
College.
It's College Hunks. Yes, it's a moving company.
H. Oh, no.
Yeah.
It's like they have these big. giant
Or it's an
cartons,
orange.
Large spots of green rating.
Yeah,
Very.
you've probably seen it.
Good for them.
Yeah, good for them. That's it. But no, I think that's a big point, is that I think also speaks to the delegate's point that it's not just a one-off, hey, housing is simply too expensive. That's the only challenge. And I think, as the ECPD data pointed out, flag is that the higher rates of at least calls for service and arrests do overlap very extensively with the areas in Baltimore County that have higher rates of poverty, higher rates of, comparing to their dashboards, crime in general, and the overdose dashboard also correlates heavily too. So it is a holistic issue. And I think that gets to one of the challenges of the working group, is that it intersects with so many other issues. Bless you. But again, there's the hope that this can be a starting point, and then we can work from there. And again, and just in general, if anyone in this room thinks of a topic that you'd like to have a meeting devoted to, please just reach out to me individually. And there's no process or hierarchy outside of flagging it as something to discuss. I know, just to bring up really two issues that have already been flagged for me as topics for 2025, is again, a specific conversation on the challenges facing the immigrant community and the language and cultural barriers. And then also a conversation about kind of cross-jurisdictional issues, because as the Family Crisis Center data showed, there's a tremendous amount of, there's no hard geographic boundaries. There are Baltimore City residents who utilize county services. There are county residents who utilize city services. I imagine that's also the case for other jurisdictions neighboring Baltimore County, Harford County, Carroll County, Anne Arundel. So trying to work out the best way to do that, to bring in other jurisdictional actors without having the conversation become unwieldy. But that needs to be part of the conversation too, because we're not an island unto ourselves in Baltimore County. I see Councilman Young's hands up.
Thanks, Henry. So I'll take a moment, I'll chime in, and I appreciate you meeting with me and Brad getting together with me prior to the holiday to talk about legislative suggestions. I just want to confirm, since we're in front of the group, that there are no legislative suggestions coming from this report, correct?
Not for specific.
Mhm.
This is a bill that needs to be passed. Yeah, and more of a general starting point with, again, the option for more specific suggestions down the road as they flow from that.
Absolutely. And after that meeting, I mentioned that I would put some things together and submit. So if everybody would bear with me, I have a document that I could read from and I can share with the group later. I just figured I would take the opportunity at the meeting to kind of share my thoughts, knowing that I had the document before, maybe before other folks, but I know. But so I'm going to go through it. I know you don't have it in front of you, but expansions of the three recommendations and additions of two others. Number one, expanding affordable housing. And also I want to be clear, these are thoughts that came out of what I was reading and also my own experience and from what I heard from the meetings. some of this already exists, some of this is already being acted upon, but I try to put things in a more specific legislative / policy perspective. So expand affordable housing. One, in addition to increase funding for housing programs, collaborating with state and federal agencies to secure additional funding for affordable housing projects. Another bullet point would be public-private partnerships to engage with private developers to incentivize construction of affordable housing through tax breaks and grants. That would be a potential legislative change. Emergency housing options, establishing partnerships with local hotels, short-term rental providers, and create pool of emergency housing options for survivors and immediate needs. And then financial independency programs that I know exist in other places, but the county could potentially work towards having their own to develop initiatives to provide survivors with financial literacy training, job placement services, and access to microloans in the case that they are a survivor or in a situation that they can't cover for themselves. Under enhancement, multilingual and cultural competency, hire multilingual staff, assess the actual functional need for bilingual and multilingual personnel in law enforcement, health, and social services to directly assist diverse communities and strategically recruit to meet that need. Another addition would be cultural competency training, implement or incorporate into existing mandatory training programs for law enforcement and service providers to increase awareness and informed engagement with survivors and diverse populations. Translation services, partner with language service providers to ensure all resources and legal documents are available through either the web, through us, or through our providers or partners for translation services, community outreach programs, engaging with leaders in multilingual communities and in minority communities to spread awareness about the availability of services related to this topic. You kind of got into it with development of a comprehensive online resource. I sort of have the same comments that a lot of this stuff is being provided, or we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but having more landing pages is a good idea. So I agreed with everything that was discussed earlier. I did want to incorporate potentially engaging with our military partners. There is extensive services through the military and National Guard related to sexual services, sexual assault, and survivors. So potentially partnering with them, or even maybe adding them to this group in the next year would be a good addition. Those are the three that you referenced. I added other new recommendations. 4 would be strengthening legal and policy frameworks, streamline legal processes, work with local court and simplify the process for obtaining protective orders and pressing charges. Again, I also understand this is my expertise, so if anybody would like to add after I send this out other notes on what's feasible, what's not, I would appreciate that. Victim advocacy programs provide survivors with legal advocates who can guide them through court procedures and paperwork where accessible and where possible. Data sharing protocols establish secure channels for data sharing between law enforcement and service providers to track and support survivors more effectively where appropriate and where legal. Also utilize BC Stat for countywide mapping of domestic violence, sexual assault, a heat map showing where a lot of these things happen, and then potentially targeting our efforts or potential strategies to try and alleviate it in those areas. Another addition for recommendation would enhance collaboration for multi-agency potentially standing up a multi-agency task force, establishing a task force that includes representatives from all relative agencies to ensure coordinated effects. While we are advocates and while we're folks within government, actually talking to department heads or key folks within departments to try and deal with these issues internally and beyond our meeting would be effective and helpful for the executive branch to make decisions outside of this group meeting. Regional partnerships collaborate with neighboring jurisdictions and share resources. This was already discussed right at the end. Henry, I appreciate you bringing that up. Feedback mechanisms, create awareness and avenues for survivors to share their experiences, not just with us and with law enforcement, but with each other so they can support each other. Also, I added another incorporation of military survivor services because they've been doing this for quite some time after addressing an issue that had been laying dormant for years. An additional number 6 addition would be educational preventative efforts, school programs, implementation of education programs in schools to teach young people about healthy relationships, concepts about relationships and good friends, and consent, and also recognizing abuse. Community workshops, organizing workshops in vulnerable communities to educate residents on their rights and available resources, either through us or through our partners in law enforcement. And this is a long shot, but potential media campaigns launching awareness campaigns to address domestic violence and awareness related to sexual assault exploitation using various media platforms. I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to speak. I know that's a mouthful. I will send this document out to everybody on the commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman, and thank you for the level of detail there, because I think that's really helpful. So I think So A, yes, you can send that out, obviously, to the group. What I'm thinking is just procedurally that we do a meeting in January incorporating and presenting some of the changes that are discussed today for a sort of a, for lack of a better word, a vote to adopt the recommendations. I think there's more to do here than what can be done in one meeting in terms of adding it, formatting it, making sure it looks nice and all those important presentation side things. And that can be circulated ahead of the meeting in January. I don't think there's any issue with saying that approving a 2024 report in the first month of 2025. I have no concern about that because I do think it's worth getting it right and making sure that this is a solid starting point for the next year and beyond as well.
So I think the difference is these are policies, and it sounded like, from what I could hear, what Councilman Young was talking about was implementation. And so I think then, the next thing is, okay, now how do we implement this? And then that's where all the things that were listed kind of come into play. That's the way it seemed to me.
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
There's the opportunity to flesh out these recommendations on the policy front as here's what we can be looking at. And then certainly there are some that are more, okay, how do we implement those, which can be beyond the report recommendations. But I do think it's beneficial to make sure the report itself is tangible to the extent that someone can read it who's not in these meetings and understand and say, okay, here's what the working group is advocating for, and with some degree of specificity.
Okay.
Right? But yeah, I agree insofar as I don't think that we need to get into the, council should pass legislation that specifically does X, Y, and Z. But I think it's important to say X, Y, and Z are issues that require some solution, for lack of that makes sense.
And Henry,
Yes,
I didn't mention this before, I appreciate your work in facilitating these meetings for the last year and change. I just want to make sure too, like you said, you want someone who has not been participating in these meetings to read this document and get an idea of what are we going to do without specifically stating the council will do X, the administration will do X, especially knowing that we're going to have a new administration here in a month. So I understand the sensitivity towards that, and I didn't want to get into wordsmithing. If we had 5 people at the table create a document, it would all look completely different. So I appreciate the work you put into this. Just want to make my own recommendation too, where if we're going to call it a recommendation, let's make a recommendation. That doesn't mean that we have to say that we will do X, but then generally stating the thing that we all around this table have been working towards and folks have been spending their entire career doing. I think we have an opportunity and we have a responsibility to be more specific about what does it mean towards housing. We don't need to restate the issue. We know the issue, but we can state that under. But what there is the recommendation. If the recommendation is to partner to make sure that these opportunities are available to survivors, then we should state it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I don't think it holds a future administration or departments to an action that would that we weren't or they weren't charged with doing. So that's end of my rant, but I appreciate the opportunity to say it.
I think that it's well taken. Does anyone else have any? Amy?
I do. Again, Amy Blank from the Baltimore County Commission for Women. A couple of years ago, we had a public policy retreat, and what came out of that was a conversation about providing self-defense classes for survivors of sexual exploitation, violence, and interpersonal abuse. And we didn't necessarily flesh it out because all the players are already at the table. But I wanted to bring this idea to the task force itself. So what the concept was to look at empowerment-based self-defense training. I happen to have a working sheet here just on the concept of the training itself. And what we could do as a county would be to put forth a budget initiative in order to provide a pilot program first for the individuals for whom we all serve and have been focused on in this task force, and provide maybe drop-in programs around the county And we would all work out the details of all of that, the time, the place, providing the childcare, transportation, and the like. But the bottom line would be, if we looked at it as a pilot program, unfortunately, this is not necessarily the prevention of the first or last time, but it is an intervention at this point with this particular group of individuals and their families. But what it would be doing, and I think the bottom line to that is that this type of training really teaches women not necessarily to become fighters, but to empower them to know that they're worth fighting for. And we know painfully that a lot of the circumstances women are in are both physical and emotional, spiritual and the like. And so one of our former commissioners started taking self-defense classes, and this kind of idea bubbled up through her. And she has found that it profoundly empowering in addressing fear and anxiety and helplessness and a variety of things that she was struggling herself, and watching in these trainings women struggling for themselves and their children, right? Because we also know that this is oftentimes generational and that hurt people hurt people. So the concept was to provide this type of training. It turns out that we have reached out to one provider, but obviously this would probably be a multitude of providers and programs. But for $25, we could train women at least in one class. Now, I understand that doesn't give them necessarily the tools, tactics, and techniques to become profoundly proficient in self-defense. And part of that would also be teaching them their legal rights when it comes to self-defense, as well as the propensity of having to address protecting oneself with perpetrators that are known and unknown, and in a variety of environments. And if we looked at it in terms of the numbers and just looked at it in terms of a pilot program with those individuals, let's just call it, we maybe focus first on individuals who've already asked for protective orders and have been granted those, or may not have been granted, but are pending and so on. That's roughly 3,000 women at $25 a class, right? With some ancillary programming on the side, or in addition to childcare and transportation and the like. That could be about $200,000 just as a pilot. And this is not to take away from, because we will never provide enough financial support for those for whom that are there day in and day out for these women and their families, but in addition to. And to be able to flesh out some of those details so that women could feel safe being provided a resource such as this, and to start watching because many of these programs, all these programs are evidence-based. There's been years of trauma-informed interventions that are incorporated into this particular training in and of itself. And all of us are at the table, right? All of us who are connected with these individuals and their families are already here, right? So the ability to communicate with them and reach them, we already have those processes, including talking about the social platforms in which we would reach out to them. So I wanted to bring this up as a potential opportunity for all of us to consider as a task force. We've already considered it as a commission and have throw our full support behind it, and wanted to bring it up today in hopes that we could maybe not flesh out all details, but have a cursory conversation about the concept.
Thank you, Amy. No, I think it's worth discussing. I'm hesitant to include it as to recommend it as a recommendation simply for two reasons. I think firstly, I think it does warrant, additional conversation as a working group to flesh out how that would look. And also just my only hesitance is to sort of slap a budget request into the report, just given the uncertainty as far as the timing of this and also the transition coming. So, but I think it's an excellent point for conversation and discussion and to look at it as an issue and a suggestion going forward, if that makes sense.
On a different topic, you mentioned the protective order process, but I wasn't clear on how do you want to, as a group, look at that exactly that in 2025?
So we had the initial presentation on it by the department, which I thought was very, very informative. So for the purposes of just for the website, it's providing probably a slimmed down version of that presentation as a guideline. Something as simple as knowing what to request, a peace order or a protective order. Because I had clients when I was in family law who did the wrong one and had trouble with it, and it created just, again, simply paperwork issues on their end because they didn't know the difference. And there are also just, again, I think providing kind of a step-by-step, here's what to expect, because I think for a lot of people, it's entering the unknown and having something that is readily accessible, which again, won't be specific to every instance, but okay, here's the difference between an interim and a temporary and a final, and here's how they process, and here's the length of times for each of them, and here's what happens if you show up and they don't, and the abuser doesn't show up, and all of that, so that it's somewhat clear and laid out before someone dives headfirst into it and goes to a courthouse, which can be a daunting process. But I do think it certainly there's room for further conversations. I know Councilman Young flagged in his proposal the need to, or the interest in discussing the process and making sure that service is, again, reliable and consistent. That was something that came up in our meeting on the presentation, was that there's concern about survivors not knowing when the abusers served, or having there be long gaps between when they request and when service actually occurs. So I do think a follow-up conversation is probably warranted on that to discuss ways to improve the process.
Can I just add one thing there? 'Cause I'm gonna have a bill on firearm relinquishment and civil proceedings this year, so would love this group's input on that too.
Sure.
And that is another area.
Is that the same one from this year?
Yeah, no, sorry.
Well,
No, this is a new.
it's a different one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Henry, but, and I think the firearm relinquishment is a very important piece. The focus that I remembered from that meeting was the issues with protective order services. So I thank you for circling back to that, and certainly Councilman Young. Just a brief update, it's not finalized yet, but the police department has been working with the courts to be able to electronically share. So right now it's a paper share, which creates a real significant delay and issue. We're not there yet.
Sure.
Come into this century?
Sorry. Talking Baltimore County, sir.
All right. Well, believe me, I know.
That is, I do believe that that's a key piece that will help streamline the process for service.
Yes, that's still, if you can go spend the same thing. That's certainly huge, that is big enough work.
But if you can let us know how that goes and the updates, because I think there's also the portal is it's a access that point that domestic violence service providers who have access providers that can be able to apply for certification that Becky manages, and it's a huge asset. But if we could also get petitions for those.
Can you explain what that is?
Okay, so it's Jade Portal, it's like K-Search, but it is like a souped up version of K-Search, in the sense that we can see, we can search by both the petitioner's name and the respondent instead of just the respondent. And we can see the actual protective order, not just the entries, and then there was ones. And it's really helpful for us from an advocacy perspective, but the petitions are not there. And with that, we sometimes when we're advocating for legal representation, they say, well, I need to see the petition. So then our clients are going back and taking pictures with their phone, sending us to us, sending Laura. I mean, it helps.
So that's housed anywhere?
Well,
The petitions.
the petitions, I believe, are certain how many parts. Okay. And, but also on top of it, if they don't have an extra copy, and the respondent shows up to their home before they've been served, and we're saying to them, if they show up, you can call 911 and get them served. If the police officer doesn't have the full petition with, or the full order with the petition, then it's not served.
And it has to be here, it can't be on their phone.
Well,
Is that right?
From what?
The respondent has to be able to take a copy.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Yeah. So what, from what you're saying, that might have, like, we might be filling that gap in the sense that they can get it on it. So it's not on the victim, but I mean, if we can sort of do both images, it would be.
I will make sure that that's part of the conversation. The police department perspective on the conversation is when somebody goes to a commissioner or goes to a judge in the middle of the night, that paper copy has to make it from wherever that is to wherever that officer is. And there's oftentimes a big breakdown in that.
Right.
The J portal is a fantastic, it's already existing, access is already there. It's in essence, Maryland Judiciary Casework is a public facing side of the same system. And it's just, there's some stuff that's more sensitive. Original issue arrest warrants can be seen in J portal, they can't be seen on case search, so somebody doesn't have a warrant. And so it's a good system. But I guess my whole point in originally asking, and it's something that you can keep on your radar, is you were talking about meetings for 2025. I don't know if it rises to that level, but just want to make sure that that stays an action item.
Sure.
I do think that's a very tangible, something that we can sink our teeth into as a group.
Agreed. Yeah, and it's an issue that is, I think for a lot of survivors, it is their first point of entry into this world, is receiving a protective order or a peace order and making sure that it be served in a timely fashion and they know the way through the process. I think is an important step. Senator, if you don't mind elaborating on what your bill would change or do differently with the firearm issue with
So, and we're still working on it.
Sure.
So I'm a little hesitant to give too many details because they haven't all been fleshed out yet, but it's right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, at the interim, the judge may relinquish.
Interim is usually the commissioner.
Okay, so then at the final, final shall, okay. So now it is shall at the temporary, under the bill, it would be shall at the temporary with good cause. So that is a major, and also at the first, like a commissioner could.
Okay.
So meaning at the time of
With good
service.
cause. Yes.
Okay.
But, and we're still working and thinking about police visit to make sure that that actually happens. And then, kind of what that looks like, we're still fleshing out.
Sure.
If that means a warrant or not. But still, because we know, unfortunately, like too many times, and we're seeing it too many times across the state of Maryland, that somebody has a firearm and it hasn't been turned in. They're supposed to. And some counties do it better than others, but it's a lot of Swiss cheese right now.
Right. And I think also that, just speaking personally, that temporary process is often, between the temporary and the final, is sometimes the highest
Danger.
because it's this point where the person, the abuser's been told you've done something wrong, but hasn't finally gone. There's not that, almost that element of closure where it's like, this is now in place for the next year or for however long. So I think that's an interesting.
So I'm happy to share it with people too.
That'd be great. Yeah.
We're getting close.
Speaking with protection orders, I think we all kind of agree that having victims sit through peace order hearings while waiting for a protection order hearing for themselves can be a terrible situation where you have neighbor disputes and all that, and then there's this person who's been viciously attacked. We have it all the time where they say, well, can it be separated? We would love to have peace and protection orders be separated, but theoretically, it's not an option is what we're told. Can we put that out there again to have peace orders and protection orders be separate dockets?
You're going to get a huge pushback
Oh, yeah.
from the bench. Because, you know.
It's more work for the.
Well, I mean, what has been happening over the last couple of years is, you know, now we have the drug court, now we have veterans court, now we have, I mean, they just keep breaking everything down and the bench like can't cover all this. That's what they're gonna say. So, I mean, I just tell you, it's gonna be a big pushback.
I brought it up at Catonsville to a couple of the judges, and they've said the same. Some of them truly think that it's beneficial. Some of them completely are against it because there's so many breakdowns. But when you speak to a victim afterwards and that they've sat through 3 neighbor arguments, coworker arguments about, you know, where my property line is, and here they are coming in completely battered black and blue, and their order is, you know, second to last. I'm sure you guys have seen it. They want to walk. They want to walk because this is the same docket that I have to sit through.
Right.
So and again, some of the judges, they understand and they will look at who's sitting in the room. They'll take call and that's great. Some of them just go however the stack is.
Right, the order.
Yeah.
And that may be worth, in that additional conversation on protective orders, bringing in and see if we can get someone from the judiciary to come in and at the very least, you know, have that conversation with them, discuss again their perspective and but also hear from providers' perspective as well on behalf of your people you serve. So
Is it just so so I understand, it's the same docket and they feel like what they are sitting through is a minimization of what they have
Absolutely.
experienced. Okay.
it's also very long.
They're very
Yes,
long time.
they can be 4 or 5 hours.
If you have, you know, 20 plus of the docket in district court, and then the ones where the respondent doesn't show up and the judge gives the description of the whole it can be a very, very lengthy.
And the judge doesn't have the discretion to hear protection orders first, right?
Well, that's
Can
a
they
question.
front,
Can they
can't they front look
prioritize
that
it?
and prioritize?
They can.
Right.
They can.
But it's up to, yeah.
They don't.
The problem is, very often, the neighborhood peace order is going to go a lot quicker than the protective order. And so it's like, let's get these 5 people out of the courtroom and then I can sit back and listen to.
Maybe we can do the lunch break and then I'll come back and hear the protective orders. And so it becomes sort of a workload management versus a personalized process. Because a lot of judges, it's in, you know, multiple times a week, they're hearing the dockets. Yeah.
Some judges also say like they want to get the quick neighbor disputes out so that there are not so many people.
People in the room, right,
Like,
it's to hear
It's
it,
a public
right?
hearing, but
Yeah.
still like to minimize the number of people in the public as well. Like, so it's, I
Yeah.
hear what you're saying 100%. That like, that is, yes, I absolutely heard that to be a victim experience for sure. But I think from a judicial perspective, like there's definitely pros and
There is, and it's just, I've heard it several times in the past month since our last one, so it's just.
Sure.
Wouldn't it be as easy though as you said it at different times? Like it's one docket, but you have peace orders at 1, you have protective orders at 3,
Yeah.
2, and just have them come in. I mean, like that's easy and it's not actually separating it out.
I know Catonsville does the docket Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Mhm.
So Tuesday, Thursday, if they were to do the peace orders on that day versus protection order, peace order docket. It's a simple solution, but there's definitely a lot of other steps that need to be taken. Obviously, the bench is gonna have the final say.
Sure.
But it's worth a conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, just the scheduling thing, like.
Well, maybe that'd be a great conversation for us to have with them,
Yeah, that's what I was
right? In
thinking.
order to share that.
I think we could
And
do
look
an
at the
entire
strategies.
session on
Yeah.
protection orders, yeah.
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 Right.
And that's the nature of these things, is that none of the topics we brought up in 2024 go away.
Right.
2024, so there's no reason not to bring it back and have an update based on questions and thoughts we had from the, we got the perspective really of the law enforcement side of it. We can incorporate the other elements of it as well. But,
So I
sorry.
have 5 potential topics for next year.
That's good.
And I honestly was hoping that we get to some of them this year. So I don't know if any of them are policy areas that we want to talk about now, likely not based on the time. And I apologize in advance because some of them I feel like I have to give context to. But the first one would be, we have not really had a discussion on human trafficking. In the county, we continue to see the second highest number of child trafficking victims, but we continue to have problems within DSS in terms, I mean, DSS itself is working great. I think there's some issues, sorry, Brian, with the law enforcement piece and like the connection with SBU. They eliminated the police device unit, which is a challenge then to getting the cases that are not child victims investigated, because there just wasn't an identified place where that went. And so we have, in some instances, I'm being told things like there isn't human trafficking in Baltimore County anymore. And as the person that prosecuted a heck of a lot of cases of human trafficking in Baltimore County, I find that really hard to believe. And I think that sentiment is really, it negates the experience of a lot of people that are existing in Baltimore County and being victimized.
Stacy just had 2 weeks ago free, and we had to relocate them all. And
We just, in the county, recovered an 11-year-old that we are serving. So, I mean, it is very real. And I think that, so saying things like it doesn't exist here anymore, and it's simply because I don't think there's enough resources being put into trafficking cases. I will also say, like, there's all kinds of things that are happening across the state and nationally around diversion courts or different ways of capturing populations that are at risk for trafficking, so we can ensure that they're not at risk anymore. So that's one. There is in Baltimore City, we've seen an increase in sexual violence of like 7% generally in terms of investigations and prosecutions. I don't know what the numbers are in the county in the last year, but I think that when I've been interviewed on the topic, I think it is because more and more people are having faith that their cases are going to get investigated and prosecuted. I think that we're doing a lot of great work in that space in terms of transparency. I think that we should discuss how we can continue that process. People want to know what's happening with their cases. They still sit and wait for a very, very long period of time to get that information. They want to see how many cases are being prosecuted in Baltimore County, and what the results of those prosecutions are, because too few victims, we know this 1% of people actually get their cases to a conviction, and that we should find, I think, unacceptable.
Amanda, speaking of trafficking, our office has a human trafficking dashboard that will be public soon, and it's going to be based on court data. So it's, how many cases were there, how many were actually prosecuted, charged, what's the sentence length, and all of that. So when that is live, I can share it with the group.
That's phenomenal. Yeah. I know that there was a ton of conversation a year ago about family justice centers. I don't think we ever tackled that topic, and so I think it is worth discussion if that's still something that people would like to discuss, if they still think it is something that is viable. In that it would also be potential co-location of SVU and the designated rape crisis center. There has been different discussions with different groups around a different makeup of service providers in the county. I know it is an uncomfortable topic as a service provider in the county, but I'm willing to put it on the table that if that needs to be discussed, if we don't have full coverage, if it needs to look differently, if there needs to be better partnership or collaboration, like whatever it is, I think that it's worthy of discussion if there are gaps in services. And then the last is what I think I heard as the victim service providers were providing all the information, our data, like all of us calculate numbers differently, and it makes it so we really cannot have an in-depth conversation about what the service provision looks like in the county. So maybe there is like a regulation of that data in some way, so that we can ensure that those numbers reflect, so we can dive into the data and look at the gaps in services. And then I'll just add money. Like we all need money. So there.
So who should we ask for money?
Mm-hmm.
Who would that be?
Maybe a conversation.
Time. That was a joke. I'm sorry. Don't the council.
I was gonna say like.
All right. So being cognizant of folks' time in general, but so there. Thank you, Amanda, for outlining that, because I think that's a really good, in addition to some of the other topics we mentioned, a really good jumping off point for scheduling things for next year. I'd also like to hopefully increase the volume of meetings now that we've done a year sort of and laid. I think a lot of the groundwork's been laid. I think there's a lot of, okay, we've sort of hit the whole top level, so to speak, but now we have the opportunity to dive deeper into it, and also acknowledging that not everybody can attend every single meeting, but they are all being recorded, and we'll have recordings circulated and notes circulated. I think we can do more of these. And even if it ends up being, 15 versus 25 people in the room, it can still be a useful conversation if we make sure that, on the scheduling side, that folks who need to be for each of those are in there, because some will be more relevant to some providers or some agencies than others. So here's my ask for everybody now, because I'm going to circulate this week dates in January, which we can have a final discussion and approval of the report, and then also hopefully another topic to discuss as well, acknowledging that, you know, I don't want to have everyone have to come in or hop on WebEx just to review a report, but also to have an additional conversation. And I'll start again, looking at who we can get in for January. If people can send to me any, I don't know, Amanda, you mentioned this, Councilman Young mentioned this, any sort of additional edits and changes to the recommendations. If they can get in before the week of Christmas, I can make changes, incorporate them into the document, and share the document for ahead of final approval. And likewise, if people can submit their proposed discussion topics as well for 2025, and I will try to schedule those out in a way where make sure that Delegate Holland White or White Holland, Senator Hettleman can be in attendance for the ones that may have particular relevance at the state level. So, i.e. after session ends, because I want to make sure you all can attend and participate. Or Monday. That's true. That's true. It's a good point. So that's my ask to everybody here, just so that we can keep this process moving. That is one of my chief goals as we enter this transitional period, to make sure that we continue to highlight this important work. I think it's something which is not going away as an issue, and I think it intersects with so many other issues that the next county executive, that the county council, that every level is going to be dealing with. I mean, we've touched on that. It deals with housing, poverty, crime, human trafficking, the courts, the department. It's something which needs to continue to be a focal point of future conversations. And so that is what I have. But I really want to thank everybody for, again, being a part of this group this year as a whole, for today's meeting, which I think has been extremely productive in terms of narrowing down and highlighting what we want to focus on, what we want to recommend. And I'll open the floor once more for anybody, if anyone has any additional comments, feedback, questions before we wrap for 2024.
So I just want to say thank you. I mean, this is a big group. We have a lot of expertise and a lot of great input here, and we're going into a period of transition. And so I just speak for myself. I hope we can keep moving forward in really tangible ways to be able to advance some really good policy changes.
Absolutely.
I think we should also look at ways in which we individually and collectively can bring about the changes we've been consistently having conversations about, that don't necessarily have to lean on the changes that are going to take place on the state, on the county, and more importantly, the federal level. And that we should just maybe find the ways in which we can at least tinker and tweak things that are really shouldn't be that difficult. And we don't need to wait for a report, and we don't need to wait for an interim county executive, and we don't need to wait for two new districts, right? We can start doing these things now. Many of them didn't ask for additional dollars or legislative initiatives. And I'm glad we're having those open conversations. But I hope that we get to some resolution, and we start making these changes that we are very capable of making tomorrow if we want to. But I also do thank you, Henry. Thank you for your mind and your heart and bringing us all together, and for everyone who works on this day in and day out. I appreciate all their hard work and their passion.
I want to second that last point, because I'm just here to facilitate and help these meetings move smoothly, but the people in this room are actually the ones doing the real work and helping to effectuate change. So seconded.
Yeah, and Henry, from the police department perspective, Chief McCullough has obviously continued dedication to this topic and to this work group, but I think we as a police department are always very thankful when our partners are in the room. Oftentimes we look at as if we are the lead, and really we are just a group of partners with the folks that are in the room. So it's very thankful to the county executive, to you, Henry, for your leadership, the state and local delegation, to Councilman Young, the delegate to Senator as well. The police department, again, acknowledges a lot of the change that you said, and a lot of the individual efforts can make those changes. We have great dedicated police officers, but to your point, Amy, the partners in the room are the tinkerers. They are the ones that figure out how to get stuff done despite not having the resources or the organization. So the police department is very pleased and thankful to be part of the process here. Thank you, Henry.
Of course. And just this final point there, I'm always happy to have one-on-one conversations with anybody in this room. If there's something you want to discuss as a potential topic or something like that, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And likewise, if there's just something a conversation that you think is better suited offline, I'm happy to have that as well. So.
And if I could just also thank everybody for allowing me to participate, have a connection to the council. One, I appreciate all now being part of my network and me being part of yours, and just want to make sure that I put out there that while this has been informative for a year for me, because it also helps inform and keep my mind on this topic when we're discussing things in the council and privately with my other council members. Outside of this room, you're now part of my network, and if there are discussions that you'd like to have related to policy in the county or changes that need to be done legislatively, I'm happy to have those one-on-one with you as well outside of this work group now that we're connected in this forum. So thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Henry, for your facilitation throughout the year.
My pleasure. My pleasure. All right. Okay. With that, we'll adjourn. Thank you, everybody.